Hello, Grats and Gits. Welcome back. So I'm pretty pumped up to put this video out. A lot of people found tons of value in part one. So this is part two now of how to deny secondaries to your opponents. Part one was all the secondaries you could only draw in tactical. Part two is all the secondaries you can take as fixed. Important to remember that some of these secondaries that you can take as fixed, you can also draw in tactical. So there will be a very small amount of overlap. So let's get right into it. This is a massive freaking skill. And I kind of went over this part in the last video, but this is just be a real quick reiteration. Denying secondaries is one of the biggest skills that's going to separate a ton of your 3-2 players from your X and 1 players. What I mean by X and 1 means X amount of wins versus 1 loss, which is about the best that any player in the game can ever expect to go at a tournament. Because there's always going to be a list that counters your list. There's always going to be a map that just your list hates. So there's always going to be a little bit of a luck involved when you're trying to win a tournament, but you can plan on going X and 1 based off of your skill factors. And this is one of those skills that really takes you over the edge. So get ready for it. Guys, there's a lot of secondaries out in this game right now. And this is going to be quick and short when I go through each individual secondary, but it's going to give you massive freaking value. And the last point I want to go over here is denying secondaries not only decreases the opponent's score and forces them into risky primary plays, because now that they know their secondary score is going to be lower, they have to compensate by getting more primary. It's also going to stick them with that secondary card for another round, which will, one, deny them the ability to discard it for CP. Two, it's going to force them to be able to try to accomplish the same goal in their next turn, or maybe they'll have to spend a CP to ditch it, which they previously didn't want to. So it can be absolutely devastating sticking your opponent with a secondary card that they were not prepped for. Now, this video, remember, we're also talking about how to deny it in a fixed context as well. So we'll talk about the tactical and the fixed and how you'll do it a little bit differently based off of what your opponent chose. And then, yeah, that's basically what I just said. So one last aspect. Sorry, I know that was the last one. This is the last aspect of secondaries before we get into the actual meat and potatoes of the video. Secondaries are not necessarily random, especially when you're drawing them tactically. People like to think of themselves as constantly getting screwed by the cards. Now, this is possible. I'm not saying it's impossible to get screwed by the cards. It totally is. But the reality is most of the time when you have a dead drop or you just draw 2 secondary cards you can't draw, the vast majority of the time it's going to be your fault for positioning incorrectly. Secondary draws are not random. They're actually predictable. So whatever cards that are in the deck that are left, you can plan on what your opponent can draw, or you can plan on what you can draw. And this is a high-level skill. So if I know I can draw containments and assassinate, I should have myself positioned to make sure that I'll be having 2 units prepared to get me containment next turn. And hopefully I should do a rapid ingress that could potentially get me in a position to grab my assassinate next turn. That's what I'm talking about when I'm saying you can plan on the cards you can draw. Sometimes it is possible that turn 1 you just draw assassinate overwhelming force and you get screwed. It's possible, but it's not nearly as common as most people say. Let's get into this, how to deny secondaries. Let's start with assassinate. This can be drawn either tactically or as a fixed card. If it's drawn as a fixed card, it can be pretty hard to deny. I'm not going to lie. But if it's drawn as a tactical card, well, it can be generally fairly easy to deny, especially depending on what round it is. So if it's, say, round 4, your opponent hasn't drawn assassinate, and let's say that you have a war boss who's on 1 wound here, and he was previously engaged with these Alaris Terminators. Well, me being the savvy orc player I am, I could be like, you know what I'm going to do? It's round 4. In round 5, my opponent could draw assassinate because he hasn't drawn it yet. Why don't I just charge my war boss into your Terminators right now and let them kill me in this turn? Because you're not giving up points on assassinate if they kill you this turn. You're giving up when they draw the card. That is a great example of how to deny assassinate in a tactical sense. In a fixed sense, that obviously doesn't work because then you just give them assassinate. So when it comes to fixed, one of the things that I like to do, especially against opponents who get hyper aggressive and they're going to be like, I'm going to choose assassination and I'm going to choose bring it down or something of that sort. One of the things that I always recommend doing is understanding that at this point in time, your opponent has taken the aggressive stance and they have to be the ones who take risk to get their army in position. Since they have to take risk, you don't have to anymore. Because if they never get to your characters, they're playing 20 points down, which means you have a huge advantage. So what I recommend in that scenario is allowing them to be the aggressor and allow them to put themselves in the position where you get the jump on them. Because they have to take risk in order to force that differential to be closed. All right, let's talk about behind enemy lines. This one has become much easier to deny ever since the new data slate, where there are no longer any 3-inch deep strikes in the game. If you missed the data slate, let me just quickly update you on. There is a ruling in the new balanced data slate that says all 3-inch deep strike abilities in the entire game are now 6-inch deep strikes. And it is infinitely easier to deny a 6-inch deep strike than it is a 3-inch deep strike. It is a world of difference. I actually didn't realize how profound a difference it was until I played a few freaking games. It is very, very easy to deny 6-inch deep strikes, very hard to deny 3-inch deep strikes. So basically, you're probably never going to see your opponent take this as fixed, but if they're a mad lad and they happen to decide to take this as fixed, more or less every army in the game can pretty much 100% deny Bring It Down for at least 2 turns. I don't even care if it's a solo model that they're going to send out there for Bring It Down, or for behind enemy lines, not Bring It Down, forgive me, in my speech impediment there. Because you can make sure that you can cover a 6-inch bubble, and by a 6-inch bubble, what I mean is an area that you're denying with your units throughout your entire deployment zone for at least 2 turns. Once you've denied it 100% for 2 turns, now your opponent is screwed, because the maximum they'll ever be able to get is 12 on that secondary. And that's if you give them the ability to do it. You can also, a lot of times, just pretty easily deny it completely for 3 turns, especially if you're playing something like Orcs with a lot of models, where you can really just screen out, or if you're playing triple whirlwind Space Marines, because those bases are big enough to pretty much deny all 6-inch or 9-inch deep strikes for the entire freaking game. So it's not that hard to deny it. When you're playing against an opponent with tactical, generally speaking, I just don't concern myself about screen out behind enemy lines, unless my opponent also has not drawn like established locus. Because one thing that you really don't want your opponent to do is you don't want them to draw both behind enemy lines and establish locus, which will allow them to deep strike a unit that's going to get 3 points for behind enemy lines and 4 points for established locus. You don't want that to happen. Once my opponent has already drawn established locus or has already drawn behind enemy lines, I become a lot less worried about them drawing them together. Is kind of the way I look at it. So there you have it. All right, now let's look at Bring It Down. Bring It Down is one of those secondaries that has a unlimited cap in the tactical sense, and the fixed sense, to be honest with you. So in tactical, it basically applies the same way it plays in fixed. As many monsters or vehicles that you can kill in this turn, you're going to get points for it. So even in a tactical sense, if you kill an insane amount of monsters and vehicles in one turn, you can get 20 victory points in one turn, even with the tactical card. So the counterplay for Bring It Down is generally pretty simple when it comes to tactical cards. When it comes to tactical cards, typically what you want to make sure you're doing is that you're positioning yourself in such a way that your opponent is not going to be able to get more than 4 points on Bring It Down in a turn. Now, if you're playing an army like Chaos Knights, you got nothing. There's nothing you can do about it. You just kind of got to accept that it's going to happen. But when it comes to a fixed Bring It Down game plan, there's a lot that you can do. Once again, if you're playing Chaos Knights or Imperial Knights, sometimes there's nothing you can do about it, and you just accept the fact that your opponent is going to score those secondary points. But in other matchups, let's say I'm playing my Orcs and I'm running 2 battle wagons and 3 trucks and Deffkoptas, and I just have all these vehicles. One of the things that I do with my opponents all the freaking time is I say, okay, cool. Turn 1, I'm going to very hyper aggressively stage all of my infantry units in ruins where they're safe out of line of sight, and then I'm just going to move my trucks backward. And my trucks are going to end up screening my deployment zone, and you're literally never going to kill them. And that is going to go ahead and deny you 6 victory points right off the bat that you can never score, because you're never going to get there unless you've already tabled me, in which case I was going to lose anyway. So you can do tricky shenanigans like that, like starting to use some of your vehicles as action monkeys and not risking them if your opponent has taken Bring It Down as a fixed. Of course, like I said, this doesn't necessarily apply if your entire army is vehicles. So if you're knights or whatever, it's just you're going to accept the fact that they're going to end up scoring some Bring It Down points. Let's talk about the next secondary. This is going to be Cleanse. Now, Cleanse has become an easier secondary to accomplish, because without any 3-inch deep strikes, that also means there's no 3-inch rapid ingresses, which makes it much harder to come down onto an objective and deny your opponent's action that they are doing. So now, generally speaking, if your opponent is drawing Cleanse in a tactical sense, you pretty much just need to be positioned in a manner where you can overwatch your opponent trying to come onto the objective where they're going to cleanse, or you have such overwhelming OC, your opponent's never going to be able to get on the objective to do the cleanse action. I tend to find it's a lot of times people are going to get 2 points on cleanse, and there's really not much you can do about that. But with careful positioning, making sure that you have a good Overwatch threat, for example, or that you've got 2 objectives on lockdown, you can stop your opponent from getting the 4 points on cleanse quite often. Another thing that you can do to deny the cleanse action is the heroic rapid, or I'm sorry, is the rapid ingress into heroic intervention. A lot of times you can find these interesting abilities where your opponent is sitting on an objective and they're also charging another unit into your unit that was holding the objective previously. If you had rapid ingress, you can actually use that rapid ingress unit to heroic intervene into the opponent's charging unit and then get more OC onto the objective, hence denying the cleanse action. That can be a little bit convoluted. If you need more help walking through that, join the members only section of the Happy Crop and Wargaming Discord, which is the best freaking community Discord where we go through high level tactics every single freaking day, just like this. Quite often I'll hop on TTS and I'll just demonstrate for members. This is the paid membership area, which you can sign up by becoming a YouTube member or a member on Coffee. Links are in the description down below. And we'll just do workshops and I'll show people how to do things like this. So make sure you hop in there and get better at the game and support the channel. Love you, appreciate it. Let's get back to the video. So cleanse is generally going to be a 2 victory point action that your opponent's going to get, but very often you can fully deny it depending on how you manipulate the battlefield. Let's move on. Call the Horde. All right, Call the Horde. It's pretty niche. You're very rarely ever going to see opponent choose Call the Horde. Now, I will say there are some armies that you can trap your opponent into choosing Call the Horde on. So, for example, if I'm playing a Green Tide list and I take 3 20-man units of boys, well, now I'm giving up 15 points on Call the Horde. And my opponent goes, it's not 20, but 15 might be good enough because I'm definitely going to kill those 3 units. And all you got to do is make sure that he doesn't kill 1 unit. And it can be pretty dang easy between Theonopanes, regenerating models, to make sure one of those units stays a little bit safe. And then you can suddenly force your opponent to be stuck with 10 points on the secondary. When it comes to tactical, a really interesting thing that you can do to deny the Call the Horde is you can take some of these cheap units that your opponent doesn't expect you to be running. Let's take Neurogaunts, for example, in Tyranids. Honestly, 45 points for an 11-man squad is great, but 90 points for a 22-man squad is amazing. Because what they do with these Neurogaunts in Tyranids is you can take this 22-man squad, use that squad to 100% screen out your backfield, your opponent's never deep striking, and then suddenly when they draw Call of the Horde, they don't get to discard it for free. Because now you do have a unit that's got 20 plus wounds in it that they technically could score Call the Horde on, but they can't draw a line of sight to it, they can't charge it. Now your opponent is really kind of screwed. Orcs can do something similar with aggression. I'm actually really not opposed to that, to be honest with you. There are a lot of scenarios where you can actually deny Call the Horde just because of the type of unit that you play. Grey Knights, when they're running these big, like 10-man Terminator bricks, for example, that gives up Call the Horde, and suddenly your opponent goes, oh crap, I have to actually kill this 10-man Terminator unit. So there are lots of things that you can do in a tactical sense to deny Call the Horde. Whereas for fixed, it's really just list building. All right, let's get into engage on all fronts. Engage on all fronts, there's generally nothing you can do to stop your opponent from getting engaged on all fronts. Most of the time, your opponent's gonna get engaged on all fronts. The best you can do is make it unattractive. You can be like, all right, cool. If you move here, I'm gonna Overwatch and murder this unit that's trying to get you engaged, which means you're gonna have to use another unit to then get you engaged, which I'm then gonna kill on my turn. So you can do things like that, which can kind of dissuade your opponent of wanting to score engage. But a lot of times, this is up to your opponent whether or not they want to score engage. That one's not the hardest one. Let's talk about the Established Locus. Established Locus goes hand in hand with the behind enemy lines, which I was talking about earlier. First things first, you need to know about Established Locus. If your opponent scores this, let's say they take it fixed, and they score this 5 times, as long as they only score it in the center, that's only 10 victory points, and your opponent's probably not that happy with it. So what do you do about it? You just make sure they don't do it in your deployment zone, which can generally be pretty freaking easy, especially if you're also trying to screen out things like behind enemy lines. In a tactical sense, you want to make sure that you keep your deployment zone fully screened for at least the first 2 turns. Sometimes there's just nothing you can do. Your opponent draws Established Locus in round 5, they pick up their Calidus, they go back down and they score it. Not much you can do about that, but what you can do is you can control when they can score established locus in a tactical sense, right? You can force them to only be able to score the good 4 points if they draw it in rounds 4 and 5. Otherwise, you're forcing them to score with the 2 points. And it's a lot better to force them to score it with 2 points than it is to give them the 4 points. So that's established locus. Then lastly, we have the final one, which is going to be storm hostile objective. Now, this one is very much so always in your control. You get to choose when your opponent can score a storm hostile objective. I have found that a lot of people are talking online about wanting to use storm hostile as a fixed objective. I tend to think this is a really bad idea because what you're doing is you're telling your opponent, hey, if you're okay playing for rounds 3, 4, and 5, and you don't care about scoring secondary in round 2, you can basically deny your opponent 8 victory points right off the bat. Because it's only 4 victory points when you storm the hostile objective. That is a bit of a problem. So if my opponent ever does take storm hostile as a secondary, I just make sure he literally can't storm hostile for the first 2 battle rounds. Make sure if I have any infiltrator units, they're not holding an objective. Make sure if I am going to move out to my natural expansion, I put so much OC and so much death on it that my opponent would never even think about trying to take it. So for the first 2 battle rounds, boom, he can't score any secondaries. And then in the 3rd battle round, if I'm behind on primary, maybe then I'm willing to start giving him the opportunity to start taking it. But if I went 2nd, it's pretty freaking easy to force him to maximally be able to score 8 on the storm hostile objectives, you see. Now, in a tactical sense, what you do is you look at the round you're in. If I'm in round 4 and I know my opponent has not drawn storm hostile, and it's very likely that he's going to be getting a storm hostile style objective, sometimes I'll just walk off the objective that I don't have 100% secured. I don't want to touch this objective because you could draw storm hostile objective. This only really works if I'm not desperate for primary. So this does require you to be playing a good primary. So a lot of times what you do for Storm Hostile is you accept that you are going to give it up, but you freaking punish your opponent for doing so. So for example, you can see this little picture I have here. I have my scouts touching the objective, and my opponent is playing the orcs. Now, my opponent with the orcs can do one of 2 things. One, he can just step on the objective. And when he steps on the objective, I'm going to overwatch the crap out of him, kill most of his orcs. I won't kill every single one of them, but I'll kill most of them. So I'm severely punishing him. Maybe I might actually kill enough to make it so there's only 2 left, which means now my scouts are holding the objective. It's an option. Maybe I don't kill enough, but I still punish them severely, and then in my turn, now I have the ability to score a storm hostile objective or an overwhelming force, for example. So what you do is you punish your opponent for scoring his secondaries. If you can't deny the secondary, you can punish them for scoring it. So I like to set little traps like this up all the time, and I highly recommend you do it as well. Guys, this concludes how to deny secondaries. If you missed part 1, I'm going to try to link it somewhere here or here. I always forget which side it pops up on. Make sure you go check that out. This is one of the highest level skills that you can obtain. It is challenging and it does take practice, but once you start denying your opponent the ability to score points, suddenly you don't have to score as many, and you can afford to not score primary in turn 2 because you know you've denied your opponent tons of secondaries or primary for that matter. So take this skill, learn it, and until next time, crump on. All right, guys. Have a lovely freaking day. Bye-bye.